little while back during my arcade port series, I uploaded every home conversion of the very awesome side-scrolling shoot 'em up that was Silkworm. Many commented on that video at the time suggesting that SWIV wasn't a sequel to Silkworm. Well, SWIV was created by the Sales Curve, who converted most of the Silkworm games over to the 8-bit and 16-bit computers at the time, and since 1991 people have on and off debated whether or not SWIV was a sequel or not. Sure, it has similarities, only this version is a vertical top-down scrolling game, but the Sales Curve have always denied this and said rather it took inspiration from Silkworm whilst they coded their various ports of it. The abbreviation of SWIV allegedly translates to Special Weapons Indirection Vehicle, or also as Silkworm IV or Silkworm 4, which is a type of weapon used by enemies within this game. Personally, I believe that the Sales Curve produced this game as a sequel, but for copyright reasons had to bypass the direct Silkworm branding. That's just a wild guess though, but I might be wrong. Storm published most versions of SWIV, who also published a couple of other notable games such as Saint Dragon and also Rodland, which I also covered in my arcade conversion series. So SWIV released pretty much on all major computer platforms in 1991, roughly around the same time with the exceptions of a few other versions, which I'll also cover in this video. As I said, it's a top-down vertical scrolling shoot 'em up. If you love blowing things up from helicopters or even jeeps, then SWIV is definitely for you. It's an old school classic that wasn't an arcade game. So today we are attempting to establish the best overall version of SWIV from its original releases. I will start the ranking of SWIV with the MSX version. Now, I will say here that I don't particularly think that SWIV is a bad game on any platform. Some are just much slower than others, and some, just like this one, are presented in monochrome. This particular version of the game just looks like a cheap direct port of another particular system in this list. But that's a theory, and that's not a fact. It is fairly slow, but for an MSX game it scrolls at an acceptable rate here. The sound effects here are fairly dull, and there came a point where I actually felt some of the sounds kind of reminded me of Atari 2600 games. The game can be a little less responsive to control than most other versions at times. The Amstrad CPC release isn't particularly a diabolically bad version of SWIV. It is just a very basic game in how it looks with its monochrome colour scheme. It's also a fairly slow going game, not as slow as the MSX version, and at times I was left waiting for helicopters and other enemies to shoot at. There wasn't much consistency here with waves of enemies to attack. Controlling the helicopter was fine, and also pressing fire to shoot was responsive enough. The Amstrad version looks much like a ZX Spectrum game, likely ported directly from the ZX Spectrum, but that is a wild guess and that's not a fact. Enemy turrets that come at the floor have no sound, they just appeared, which just seemed a little boring to me. By the time I made it to the Goose helicopter or mini boss, I just got bored of playing this version. It just wasn't very exciting to play like other versions of SWIV. I would say that destroying enemies with the smashing sounds weren't too bad here. Games like this literally made it pointless in owning an Amstrad colour monitor back in the day, although some games for the Amstrad which were programmed with the Mode 0 often looked fantastic and made great use of the premium colour screen as opposed to the monochrome green screen. Now, don't be fooled with boring colour scheme with the ZX Spectrum versions of SWIV. I always say if you can get past the monochrome, you are a winner, and for my audience outside of the UK, the ZX Spectrum was one of the leaders in Britain in the 1980s and even up to the early 1990s. This is likely the version which you had a bad version of for the Amstrad CPC, and even maybe the MSX, although this specky version runs much faster than both, and it doesn't feel like you are drifting into a coma before getting to the Goose helicopter halfway through. The better frame rate here just means this version is much more enjoyable, and also the colour hues are nicer. Although only 2 or 3 colours are used at any time during the gameplay, These are much more brighter than the Amstrad and MSX's version. Even the HUD area on the right hand side of the screen looks better here. I actually made it through to the second stage here. Sure, bullets are just little black pixels, but once upgraded to dual guns, that's when this version gets better. It actually feels like you are playing a decent top-down shoot-'em-up. Although I would say in Amstrad's defense, I don't think the crashing sounds on the Spectrum's version was as good as that version. What can I say? Commodore 64 literally won the war of the 8-bit computers, with regard to SWIV that is. This is also the hardest version due to its improved speed and faster travelling bullets being fired at you. We have sprites here that weren't in the Amstrad or Spectrum's versions. Sprites that blow up instead of fragments flying your way. We have invincibility pickups here, and the Goose Copter, who you battle through midway, actually feels more exciting to take on. The attack patterns of the Goose is a little bit more substantial here, as when it breaks down into a smaller version, it just relentlessly fires at you, offering you more of a challenge. We have a typically awesome introduction theme for the game using the might of the incredible SID chip, and we have solid vertical scrolling action. Now, in comparison to the other 8-bit versions, sure, the sprites are much smaller with the Commodore 64 release, but for this, we have a bigger gameplay area and isn't overcrowded with larger sprites. We have plenty of room to maneuver, and of course this is in full colour too, which is a bonus and helps us decipher between bullets and scenery details. From the start of the game, it feels like there is some oomph in your weapon that you are firing. Forget a small pixel which represents bullets, we have true firepower here in good old 8-bit style. A more substantial look for SWIV, where more sprite detail and the illusion of enemies' aircraft look like they are actually flying, with good shadow work beneath them as they fly down towards you. Everything looks fairly nice here, although I might say a touch on the darker side in terms of colour palette used. It's good enough to control, but does suffer from a slower paced gameplay. There are more sound effects used for this Atari ST version compared with others. For example, when turrets come out of the floor, they make a nice sound. I did find that maybe the sprites used here were a little too big and didn't have much maneuver room to avoid enemies playing this version. Now, this was a seriously tough call between this Acorn Archimedes 1992 release by Chrysalis or the version I actually chose to put in first place. I will say that this system powered the game really well, and it certainly was smoother than the Atari ST's version, and the gameplay area has much more maneuver space to avoid enemies and bullets heading our way. This is a generally nicely presented game, and it looks a very premium game. It was released in 1992, and I highly recommend checking this one out. So I'm going to do some honourable mentions. So first up, we have got the Sega Mega Drive, and this one actually had an exclusive European release of Mega SWIV, which released in 1994 by Time Warner Interactive. Now, rather than Storm, who published and released all the other computer versions, we did have a different releaser just here. The game was still developed by the Sales Curve. The game itself is in essence the same game as the original, although Mega SWIV is actually considered as a sequel. It's not a bad shooter for the Sega Mega Drive or Sega Genesis, and definitely need to play if you haven't done so already. We also have the choice here for one player choosing between helicopter or jeep. I obviously chose the helicopter because it's just that much cooler. For another honourable mention, we have got the Super Nintendo or Super Famicom 1992 release. This was actually an exclusive version for the 16-bit classic console known as Super SWIV. This is one of my personal favourite Super NES shooters. It has a superb soundtrack which really utilises the SNES sound chip, and it looks incredible too. The visuals and gameplay in my opinion are better than the Mega Drive's Mega SWIV European exclusive. I will note here that in the United States this game is also known by the name Firepower 2000, which is the same game, just a different title. SWIV 3D was the last official SWIV game. This was actually an exclusive for IBM PC compatibles and was released back in 1996, developed and also published by the SWIV. It was the only game to totally give SWIV a 3D makeover. The gameplay is typical of this era and partly reminds me of something along the lines of Soviet Strike. I think the music in itself reeks of the 1990s and that whole PlayStation vibe going on here. Talking about PlayStation, this was originally supposed to have a version in 1997 but was never actually released. This one's definitely worth checking out. It's very unlikely many of you know about this release, but it was highly praised and had good reviews in its day. 10 years after the initial release of SWIV, the SWIV brought us an adaptation of Super SWIV for the Game Boy Color. We have music here and very good gameplay too, and this one's worth checking out for portable fans of this era. It plays nicely and has a nicely laid out options menu to also change difficulty levels and other options included. And in first place, I've decided to go with the Commodore Amiga's version. So what I found with both Commodore versions of SWIV is that for some reason both games had some more scaled sprites and bigger gameplay areas, and the Amiga was no exception for this. Something which really stands out with the Amiga's version of the game is its superior sound effects. When blowing up enemy tanks or planes, it produces that explosion sound, which is followed by a very cool fade in as we pass by what we've just destroyed. The Amiga version isn't an easy one either, regardless if we have had more sprites and a larger gameplay area here. When shooting at enemies, we have a nice bright bullet impact animation, which looks really nicely done here. And if we dig deeper into the bullets, the missiles that we are firing actually have some nice detail to them, rather than having just plain black pixels or plain white with some red dots inside of them. Those little details, whether conscious about them or not, come together to bring us the best looking version of SWIV here. It was a close call between this version and the Acorn Archimedes release. Both are almost identical in visuals, but the sound was just that much better with this Commodore Amiga release. So that's it for ranking every version of SWIV today. And of course I've also included versions there which weren't actually SWIV games but sequels to SWIV. So which version of this did you enjoy playing most back in the day? I personally didn't own this game, but I do remember it being advertised, and I'm pretty sure if I had this at the time I'd have been over the moon with this and probably would have enjoyed this as much as Silkworm on my Commodore 64. Anyways, as always, give us some feedback in the comments section. Until next video comes, thanks for watching.